Hello, everyone who's joining us. We are having people logging in right now, and we'll get started in just a minute. All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Chrypinski. I'm the marketing director at Michigan Radio. I want to thank you for joining us for our Issues and Ale discussion tonight. If you have never participated in an Issues and Ale event before, this is an event series that Michigan Radio sponsors designed to engage people in conversations about important issues facing us in Michigan. And right now, I think there's nothing more important than the situation we're facing with COVID-19. Over the years, we've done a lot of these discussions at a lot of different bars and brew pubs across the state, but this is our very first online discussion. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to get started in just a minute. I do want to extend a special thank you to all of our Michigan Radio members and sustaining members who are joining us this evening. We appreciate your support. During times like this, journalism organizations, just like many others, are really facing a lot of financial hardships due to COVID-19. In fact, at Michigan Radio, we postponed our March membership drive to bring you uninterrupted news coverage related to the pandemic. So we're going to try to make up that shortfall, and we're actually going to be holding a one-day membership drive next Tuesday. We're going to try to raise a week's worth of money in just a day. So if you appreciate the news coverage you get from Michigan Radio, please consider making a gift next Tuesday at michiganradio.org. So since we are doing an online webinar, our audience is muted for this discussion. We did get some questions in advance from people, but we do want to answer your questions during the event as well, as many as we can. So we're using the chat box for that, the chat function. So if you have questions at any time, submit those using the chat function, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. Let me introduce our host for this evening. Lester Graham is the host of the Environment Report on Michigan Radio, and he's also a reporter who frequently covers government and public policy issues. Many of our listeners know him as the former co-host of Stateside. In fact, earlier this week, a documentary that Lester hosted last fall in his role as Stateside host about Michigan's prison system called Life on the Inside was awarded a regional Edward R. Murrow Award for Best Documentary. So let me turn things over to Lester and he'll introduce our panel.
Hi there, hi everyone. Glad you could join us. In the spirit of Issues and Ale, I do have my ale and I was asked to identify what I was drinking, and it wasn't anything that I picked out in particular. It just happened to be in the refrigerator, but it is a popular ale in Michigan, the Two-Hearted Ale from Bell. So thanks very much for making sure that Michigan pubs and brew pubs and brewers are supported. Anyway, let's get down to business here. I want to introduce my guests. First, let's start with Brian Calley. He's the president of the Small Business Association of Michigan and, of course, our former lieutenant governor. We also have with us Kate Knight. She's the director of the Farmington Downtown Development Authority. And Rick Neitzel, he's Associate Professor of Global Public Health at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. Thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get started. This whole idea is how do we reopen business in Michigan safely? Brian, let's start with you. What are the things we should be concerned about?
Well, we're trying to help small business owners get up to speed on some practices and concepts that they've really never had to think about before. And sometimes these things get oversimplified a bit. You hear all this discussion over face coverings and face masks, but we're trying to help small businesses understand that it's really about layering on levels of protection. That starts with health screening at the door. There's no substitute for not having sick people coming into your facility. That's your best line of defense. And then engineering distancing into your regular workflows. Don't rely on employees to remember not to get close to other people. engineer that into the regular way that work happens in the workplace. And then sanitation, of course, as the third line of defense, and then in both hands, washing hands, but also sanitation of surfaces that are regularly touched by multiple people. And then personal protective equipment is that last line of defense. So we have a lot of confidence that business owners are up for this challenge, that they can put those types of practices in place. And when you do them with a high degree of fidelity, we know that they're effective. And so that's really, I think, what the key is here. It's getting from the old practices, which really didn't, in most industries, never thought about disease prevention and preventing spread in your place of business. It wasn't like first and foremost on your mind. But today, it's more than just the regulations. It's about winning the confidence and trust of your employees and your customers. So there's a lot riding on businesses doing this and doing it well.
Well, we'll talk about that certainly a lot more. Kate, when you're talking to the small businesses in downtown Farmington, what are their big concerns and what are they planning?
Thank you. We're looking at guidelines. I spoke with a business owner last week who is recovering from COVID-19. She has 3 businesses downtown. They're very customer interfacing. She has three populations she's dealing with, including some people who are immunodeficient and compromised. And she's looking at PPE. She itemized a couple of the guidelines that she's just internally putting into place. And she thought, if I knew what would be expected, if we had a very specific list of guidelines that we could start working on now, that would be really, really helpful. And I told her, Karen, you should be writing the guidelines. And in fact, she's been informing and talking with legislators when we have a chance to represent Main Street businesses to provide her perspective. But I was at Farmington Brewing Company tonight in full character, just seeing what it's like to pick up a growler in downtown. And they had customers. They're a food business. They're open. Those in line to pick up the growler had to wait for it to be, sanitized 10 times and distributed with a mask, with a no-touch policy, and with a lot of social spacing. So we're quickly acclimating in everything from establishing how our food networks will work at our farmers market to using curbside delivery for carryout and retail experiences right now downtown. But looking ahead, it's very individualized, obviously, with our business mix, and we're just tentatively waiting, but preparing.
Professor, I think everybody's probably waiting to hear from you about what does it mean to open a business safely?
It's a great question. And so what we've been doing at the School of Public Health at U of M is trying to come up, great, thank you. Trying to come up with some ways to both objectively assess the risk associated with different kinds of workplaces. Of course, we have a whole diversity of economic sectors within Michigan, all of which may have different degrees of risk. So trying to understand those risks and then coming up with frameworks to mitigate those risks. And so Brian already quite nicely summarized our broad approach to mitigating the risk to get people back to work, where ideally we are developing engineering approaches that physically change the workplace to keep people apart, maybe implementing some, as we say, administrative controls that will change people's behavior. And then last and least, but also a critical part of our layered defense is this use of PPE. And so I've had an opportunity to review actually quite a few different business sector proposals for how to get back to work in a safe manner. And again, those don't look identical depending on the sector that we're talking about, but all of these sectors are using that same basic approach and trying to build in flexibility to make sure that their approach is most appropriate for the business that they do and their interaction with customers, and of course protecting their employees first and foremost.
Well, because I've had a conversation with the Ford Motor Company's Global Chief Manufacturing and Labor Officer, a guy named Gary Johnson, I've been thinking about what they're doing. I also talked to some UAW officers and some members about what's happening with the Big Three, because they're opening up for business on Monday. One of the things they talked about was the fact that social distancing is a real problem when you're working shoulder to shoulder with somebody, putting together a door assembly or maybe putting in seat belts or something like that. And their precautions are, goggles, face shields, and persuading their people to wash their hands frequently. Of course, they can't wear latex or nitrile gloves all the time because they've got work gloves, right? They've got these huge gloves that they need to protect themselves. And the real question I had was, is a face mask and a face shield, when you're working 2 foot away from somebody else for 8 to 10 hours, is that enough?
It's a great question. And so I think one of the things that all of us need to grasp and get our arms around is the fact that work is going to look different going forward than it looked even 8 or 10 weeks ago. The idea of working shoulder to shoulder with somebody, even with PPE on, is something that we're certainly not recommending. There are other ways that we can try to mitigate this risk. So maybe the door assembly needs to be put together in a different way or in a different sequence, such that those 2 workers or multiple workers are not working shoulder to shoulder at the same time. So simply depending on PPE, which can be quite effective, absolutely, but is really the last thing we want to be relying on, is not the approach that certainly from a public and occupational health perspective is where we want to go first. So the notion of introducing additional ventilation into that space, again, maybe separating the workers, not just in terms of distance, but in terms of time that they're spending into the particular work area, changing the way and the timing that the manufacturing process is conducted. All of these things have to be on the table so we can avoid, as you say, this shoulder-to-shoulder contact. Now, I will say, if people are wearing PPE correctly and they're provided with appropriate PPE, that PPE can be quite effective. But it's the last line of defense because it's basically placing the responsibility to keep themselves safe on the workers rather than engineering the workplace to be as safe as possible. So I don't mean to imply that work can't be done safely, but we do need to be thinking beyond just let me put somebody in a face shield and a face covering and assuming that that's going to be 100% protective.
I want to ask you, because in sitting in on your Zoom meetings, one of the small business people was a physical therapist. And I feel for her because that's going to be a really difficult challenge for her to figure out how she can ever get back into business safely until we find a vaccine. What are the small businesses in Farmington tell you that they're doing, and are they getting the advice and help they need to figure out how to open safely?
Thanks. We had a little bit of a connection difficulty there, Lester. I apologize for that. You were asking about what small businesses are asking for in terms of PPE requirements?
Well,
yeah,
and advice. And advice. We're taking some guidance from Main Street America. There's if you go to, we're Main Street Community is one of the, a handful of select level Main Street, Oakland County downtowns, and we're taking a lot of direction from them. It's very geared toward our business mix. We have a lot of independent retailers, restaurants, and mom and pop shops. In downtown Farmington, we have national retailers who are providing their own guidelines. And when you direct them to the CDC website or the SBA, we're providing webinars are very useful. The question is, where can we find the answers consistently? State of Michigan, michigan.gov is a good spot. U of M Public Health, providing updates on what we know now. We're looking at just as we get information and as it becomes more widely available, distributing it through our just our eBlast downtown channels, holding webinars, Zoom meetings, much like the one you attended by chance and by luck about a month ago, where we have experts we bring in as a forum, and they're able to answer questions and hear responses with a peer environment, and just learn together as we push forward and try to understand. One big concern I have, I'm hearing from downtown businesses is restaurants looking to expand outdoor seating. So that's not only PPE, but improvising and creating additional outdoor space. And I know other downtowns are looking at that too, converting public space safely and in a socially distanced way. Liability is a question. What happens if someone contracts COVID-19 while they're in your establishment, assuming we're able to trace very soon and detect, test, and how do they get those PPE packages?
right now, we're crowdfunding right now with the Patronistic campaign geared toward downtown Farmington businesses seeking PPE. So that's wonderful, and it's striking people's passion and their need for community and getting back together safely, but that's not sustainable. And so that's a valid question. How do we access PPE as a small business group and make it fit what that independent business needs by industry?
Brian, you represent the Small Business Association of Michigan represents a wide variety of small businesses, everything from restaurants and to small manufacturers. One of the things I was talking to somebody who owns a franchise of a coffee outfit, and she was wondering, she's concerned about the liability, and she's wondering, can the government do anything to help provide us with masks for not just our workers, but the people coming in, things like that. What kind of conversations are you having with the small businesses across the state about A, liability, and B, getting help for PPEs?
So there are two parts to that question. So there's the availability of personal protective equipment in the first place, and for small businesses that means in relevant quantities. And then there's a liability that a business would face. So one of the problems we recognized early on was even though it was hard for everybody to get personal protective equipment, even if you could get your hands on it, like 2 months ago, the lot sizes were so big. If you didn't need 10,000 masks, then you're out of luck. But so we got tired our association, the Small Business Association of Michigan, we get tired of waiting. And we did a call out to our own membership. We have 28,000 members now, and asked who does this or who could do this, who's looking at changing what they do to get into this line of business. And we had quite a robust response. And we actually created a marketplace just right on our own website where buyers that needed smaller quantities could buy smaller quantities from other Michigan small businesses. And so we're talking about face coverings here, face shields, hand sanitizer. There's a lot of different aspects of it, but a lot of it now made in Michigan. So there was a market demand, and the market has responded to that. Now, in some of these in some of these areas, though, the more than just face coverings are required. So there's some cases where medical grade face masks are needed for certain types of professions, or at least it would be preferred, or if you have high risk employees, it really is needed. And so that's a different and tougher challenge because there's a lot of competition, obviously, in the healthcare space, which are the ones who need it the most. So, but a lot of this now is starting to get filled where there are smaller quantities being sold and more players coming on the market. So we were pretty pleased with that. But when it comes to the liability question, it is a question that we are going to need our policymakers to take up. We fully expect, we know that there are going to be practices that are asked in regulations that are required of our businesses going forward. What it would be nice to have is for those practices to be kind of a safe harbor, if you will, with respect to liability. If you do these things, if you carry out these practices with fidelity, then there's some presumption or some level of liability protection that is granted in those cases. So we're entering into a legal environment that we really don't fully understand. And given that fact, to the extent that a business is following the rules that are asked of them, it seems reasonable that there be some level of liability protection, or at least presumption that rules were being that the rules being followed that required of the government were adequate, and therefore would at least provide a buffer, or, like I said, at least a presumption.
One of our viewers, listeners, I'm used to listeners, we'll call them viewers for tonight, mentioned that we should thank brewers, and I will add distillers, to the fact that they started manufacturing hand sanitizers, and some of them were giving them away for a while. I think most of them are now selling them for less than you would have to pay normally. So thank you to them. On your point about small lots of PPEs, are those only available to the membership of your organization, or can other small businesses buy them?
Well, everybody who's on that we have on our website, they sell them at large as well. So what we did for our members was just to go out there and vet a list, and can these people deliver what they say they can deliver, and that's on our website for our members. But as far as I know, everybody who's on our website, they broadly sell to the community at large as well. I'll give you a few examples. Like up in Traverse City, Elfie Logo Gear, they usually do like corporate logos, but they're doing masks and gowns, and even Stormy Cromer. They make the hat with the ear flaps. The really famous brand. You can get Stormy Cromer face coverings now, and so there's some really cool products coming out of it. And even like in Washtenaw County, Ackerval Technologies, they normally make face or mouth guards for sporting events, and of course, there's not a lot of sports happening right now. They're making face shields. So all that stuff is available through our website. We don't make any money on it, but it's just something that we have as kind of a marketplace for our members. But all of those things are also available directly from those businesses and their own promotional efforts. I think we lost Lester. Do we need
so.
Do we need somebody to be a new host here for a minute?
All right. Well, while Lester's temporarily getting a refill on his beer, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that we had come up earlier today, and some of the questions that have come up now. We had a question from Jeffrey in Zealand. He wanted to know, how can we keep any workplace safe when a large portion of workers and customers have problems wearing a face covering correctly or not at all? He said, I work at a big box retail and see it every day. Many times I feel helpless and hopeless because of that. I don't know who wants to, Rick, if you want to tackle that question.
Sure. So it's an outstanding question, and this is another illustration of why PPE is kind of dead last in terms of our prioritization of approaches. So if we can maintain social distancing, if we can introduce physical barriers, that reduces the need for the PPE to be worn or to function effectively. So there are ways that businesses can manage this risk by metering the inflow of customers to ensure that there's low density of customers in the store. Basically, people have enough space to where even if we do have a potentially infected individual in there, they're simply not getting close enough, either by distance or by the presence of a physical barrier, to actually transmit the virus to someone else. So PPE can be quite good. I think it, for many of us, probably increases our confidence or our comfort in going out. But in the grand scheme of things, that truly is our last line of defense. So things like introducing more ventilation, again, doing whatever we can to reduce the density of people per given area in a store. All of those things are, at the end of the day, going to be much more effective than having a homemade face mask on.
One other thing to add to that too, Stephen, is that the communication plan you have with your customers is really important. And if you communicate ahead of time what the expectations are in your place of business, especially when you've got a public-facing business, the type of place where the public freely walks in to interact with you, then letting them know ahead of time, or finding ways to let them know ahead of time what the expectations are, can be pretty effective too. And I've seen smaller retailers are not yet green lighted to have customers in their stores if they don't also sell essential items. But those who do and have been operating, you really do see a wide array of practices. We see some that have security people that are policing it. You cannot come in unless you have a face covering. And others, they stand there and they have face coverings for you, and they say, we've got one for you. If you take this and use it, you can come in. And others don't really police it at all. And to the extent that you can communicate those expectations ahead of time, sometimes you can avoid the confrontation in the first place, because somebody, if they don't like the rules of going in your store, and they know that you have these rules, and they don't come in the first place. So that communication plan with the customers, I think, is going to be really important going forward. And I don't think it's really received much attention at this point, but it's just something that we're really encouraging businesses to think a lot about, is winning over and inspiring the confidence of your customers, but then also setting the expectations you have of your customers, because you don't want to take on the liability or lose other customers because of their behavior in your store.
So let me just jump in and say I absolutely agree with what Brian said, and I want to highlight that the communication actually needs to go in two directions. It needs to go to the customers and it needs to go to the employees. So any company that thinks they're simply going to reopen and the employees are going to come back and we'll do business as usual is wrong. And so we need to have outreach to the employees really before they ever return to the store, so they know what to expect as well. So I think communication, as you highlight, is absolutely going to go quite a long ways towards minimizing conflict and sort of tension points around these very issues.
That's a great point, and especially when you consider that like a business owner, think of the risk profile of a business owner. They're not afraid of taking risks, right? They put their entire net worth most of the time, their reputation, their capital, everything on the line to go into business with better odds at failure than success in some industries. So what we're trying to communicate to our business owners is that you can't assume that your employees have the same risk tolerance that you do. Because as a business owner, you naturally have a really high risk tolerance. And so, but the people that work for you probably don't. And communicating that they to a point where they have both ownership in and buy-in and feel very comfortable and protected will get a better outcome for you. So, yeah, sorry, Stephen, we're just cutting you out of this whole thing.
Be quiet.
That's all right. I wasn't quite planning on moderating. I understand from Lester, he was having some technical issues with his computer battery. So hopefully he's going to be joining us again sometime soon. I do have another question related to what you were talking about there. We had a question from JT. He was talking about the fact that the state of Wisconsin allowed bars to open starting yesterday, and said that there are videos showing people partying, quote, like it was 1999. Question is, how do we either create more responsible social behavior, or do we have to wait until there's herd immunity to have people protected?
So I'll just jump in with an initial comment, but Kate, I know you haven't had a chance to chat here, so please cut me off. But let me just say, this experiment in Wisconsin, and I think it is absolutely an experiment. You know, if it's successful, in 2 weeks we're not going to see a big spike of infections associated with people who have gone out to party like it's 1999. But my suspicion is, based on some of the photos that I've seen in the media, that's not going to be the case, unfortunately. And so I think in Michigan, we've had a much more cautious approach to try to maintain this social distancing and not simply go from 0 to 100 miles per hour overnight. And so Kate already mentioned the critical importance of contact tracing and screening people. And if that's not happening, this idea of simply going into effectively totally unmitigated circumstances like they have in Wisconsin bars right now, I think could lead to some really adverse events and may put us back to where we were 8 weeks ago, with the possibility that hospitals are overflowing and people are dying in record numbers.
I want to follow up on that, and thanks for having me back.
Welcome.
All this prep today, and plugging in the computer was not one of the things I did, so I'm sorry for disappearing on you. Let's talk about second wave. When I was having my conversations with some folks this week in large and small businesses, we talked about second wave. What do you do? When do you say, okay, we've had an outbreak? And do we shut down? We had one person. We had 20 at an auto plant. At what point do you say, we've got to shut down for a while and figure this out, do some tracing? Are we prepared for that as small and large businesses? Well, Brian, let's start with you. Actually, well, I'm sorry, Brian, let me, because I want to ask Kate, because she's really on a personal level with, you know, a lot fewer businesses than perhaps you are, Brian. So are your people in Farmington thinking about, what do I do if one of my employees comes down with COVID-19?
They are thinking about that. They're looking at the cost of reopening, which is, it's substantial across the board in every facet of doing their business, including bringing employees back who have been potentially making more unemployment than they do typically when they're working as a service professional or someone who makes less than $50,000 a year. I mean, they're being incentivized right now to stay home and wait it out and be very cautious. They're thinking, once I reboot, I bring my essential staff back. Essential for them. And maybe that's a quarter of the staff, or maybe it's everybody because they've qualified for a PPE loan and they feel like it's necessary to mobilize and go full force in it. What happens 3 months later? I mean, what happens when there's a second wave or there's an infection in their place of business? What's the expectation? Do you close it? Do you shut everything back down and then go back through the painful process of reopening step by step with guidelines that are in place because of the second wave? So those are the things we can't anticipate now. It's really unknown. So as specific as we can be with guidelines and what's expected and how we could potentially plan for a number of scenarios, the better.
Brian, Governor Whitmer has been saying that the second wave could be a lot worse than what we're seeing now. If history is any judge, in 1918, that was the case. I mean, the second wave was the lethal wave. What are your people, what are your small businesses thinking about as far as, what do I do if somebody on my staff was exposed or does actually contract COVID-19?
Well, one of the things that's required when you resume activities is a COVID-19 preparedness and response plan, and so as businesses are literally required to put those into place, it means that you're going through the process of understanding the practices that are expected to you and the practices that would mitigate the disease spread. And so there has to be an expectation that those will be followed, and they'll be followed with fidelity, especially though when you consider that the process or the nature of this disease is such that it is going, at some level, is going to be with us until a vaccine is available. And who knows how fast it changes. Maybe it'll be something we have to have a new vaccine for every single year. There's a lot of open questions on this, but what we do know is that getting back to where I started, when you layer in those protections, you can make workplaces safe. I expect that there probably will be some places that do not take protections seriously enough. And there's a process to deal with those in terms of OSHA and inspections that happen and complaints that are filed by employees. I've heard from some of those businesses that have been operating all along and also from regulatory departments that there has been a very robust amount of feedback from both customers to businesses and employees to regulators when they think that practices are not being followed as they understand them to be required. So I don't think that there's a very good chance that this stuff will happen under the table. I think that it's going to get nipped in the bud pretty quick.
Well, personally, this week, I saw 2 construction crews working. Nobody at either site had any kind of PPE on. They were, one group was taking a lunch break, sitting next to each other on the tailgate of the truck. I mean, there's some people who really aren't taking this very seriously. Doctor, you study global pandemics like this. You know, if we have that kind of relaxed attitude toward this, because maybe in my county I haven't had very many cases of COVID-19, are we going to see a second wave, and what's the potential consequences of not taking this seriously?
And the answer is, unfortunately, if we don't take this seriously, as Brian said, this virus is not going anywhere. It's going to be with us for potentially ever. We've heard now the WHO say this may become endemic. The promise of a vaccine is quite nice, but it's not a guarantee. And so what I would suggest is we need to stop thinking about this as a short-term hurdle and start thinking about this as a long-term change to how business gets done in the United States and Michigan, around the world. And the more of these changes that we can make that are structural, not just requiring behavioral changes, the better position we're going to be. But if we ignore these guidelines, as you obviously have noted with these construction companies, we are going to see resurgence of the virus. Without contact tracing and screening, that could easily balloon into more of a community issue. So really, the more attention we pay up front here to monitoring and suppressing the disease, the less the likelihood, of course, of having a second wave.
Brian, I want to take some questions from the audience, and I'm going to call on Steve in a second, but I was struck by something you told me in an interview we did a week or two ago, and that was, we are going to have at least for months this issue of COVID-19, this pandemic, but do we want it to affect the economy in a way that could last for years? Would you expound on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I mean, there are some changes that could be very permanent or near permanent, and I think that we have to figure out how do we operate in a way that mitigates the risk, but also creates a sustainable base of economic activity. And for a short term, you can see how when disease is ramping up and you've got to shut things down and take very aggressive action, especially when you have a lot of questions and don't have testing and don't have contact tracing, then that's a short-term solution, but it can't be a long-term solution. And so as we learn more about the possible outcomes long-term, I think that it's created more incentive and frankly more demand that we figure out how to operate safely. Because
you also mentioned that the consumer's behavior might be changed in ways that we don't fully understand yet. A lot of people have been ordering deliveries in and using Amazon a lot more, which I'm sure your membership is not so thrilled about. Do you think that even if the gates were opened wide open right away, would people respond? Would they be like in Wisconsin and hitting the bars, or would they be more cautious?
Yeah, and the Wisconsin example, I think it's important probably to note that wasn't a policy decision. That was a legal showdown and kind of a sudden strike down of the emergency powers as a whole, as opposed to a staged reentry of economic activity. And so what I think that we're seeing, not only here in Michigan, but also looking at other states that are moving a little quicker, you can see what they're doing and what's working and what's resulting in more disease spread and that sort of thing. But in terms of long-term economic health, I think a lot of small businesses are at very high risk, and beyond the things that you might think of that are pretty obvious, like the fact that they have zero income right now and they're required to be closed down. When things are opened back up, when they're allowed to operate, and when the market does come back, when people are confident to come back and just engage in more normal looking economic activity, some of those habits will have changed. And so the adoption curve on buying online and buying from places far away has gone straight up. It was already increasing, but it's gone straight up really, really quickly. And there's nothing to say that it's going to change back to what it was when retail is more broadly opened up. Something like working from home. This is another area where the amount of office space that is used today, employers for years have thought about, well, what's the appropriate amount of remote work to have happen? Well, all of a sudden, a lot of remote work is happening by necessity. Now, what does that do to office space? So I work in downtown Lansing. What if, say, there was a 10% difference in the office space utilization in downtown Lansing? Now, there's a whole ecosystem of jobs and services and businesses and goods that are there to service those office workers. And so it's a major, major disruption in the marketplace. And we don't know how much of it is going to change back to how it was before. And I think that you're going to have some big winners, and you have some really big losers on it too.
Steve, I've got a couple of questions that were submitted in advance. Do you want me to do these first, or do we want to take?
We already addressed the first question there. Let me jump in with it, because we've had a couple questions related to liability as it applies to businesses. One is there liability against a small business if they or their customers spread COVID-19 to others? And then a related question is, won't immunity from liability let sloppy or dangerous operations off too easy?
Okay, so we talked about that a little bit, but I like this idea of if you do put, Brian, you were talking about, having strict protocol, and if you follow those, you're less liable. But would that give way, as this viewer said, to being sloppy about what you do to protect your customers and your employees?
I don't think it's likely at all that the state or the federal government is going to endorse or provide liability protection to businesses who don't follow the rules and guidelines. I don't know how willing they're going to be to provide liability protection for the ones who do follow the guidelines, because even if you do follow all those guidelines, it's not a perfect science of preventing disease spread, and it's also not clear where a person came in contact with the disease. And I think it would be natural, at least, especially if somebody is thinking toward the idea of, I want to sue somebody because I got sick, they might think, well, the employer is the first place to go for that, even if that's not where they contracted it. So those are really difficult questions. But the idea of just eliminating liability, that's not going to happen.
Kate, are you having those conversations with your members?
I am. I'm listening to this liability argument, and it's true. It really, we don't have tracing right now. There's no effective way to understand where these centers or breakouts are. So you could be contaminated in a small business, but no one will know because we can't trace it back. And as soon as we can figure that out and trace it back to the source of transmission or infection, then there will be that repercussion. That's the free market. If you're a butcher shop or a shoe store or a law firm that has had 4 or 5 breakouts with visitors coming, it's not great for business. I think that our independent retailers are smart enough to do whatever they need to do to make sure they have the most effective means of providing a safe and pleasant, clean place of commerce.
I was just, as the chats were flashing by real quickly, because I can't see the whole panel right now, somebody said, what if you're a clothier? What if you're a retailer who sells clothes and people are coming in, trying on something, and it gets put back on the rack? Anybody have any observations on that scenario?
Yeah, I want Rick to answer that, because I've had that same type of question, and I don't know what technology exists that businesses could follow in that particular example.
It's a great question, and I think this is a fine example of why the staged reopening is so critical, because there are still circumstances, and I think you've identified one right here, where we really don't have a good answer at this point. That we know the answer is not, well, let's just open up and see what happens. But you might imagine maybe we have a rotating stock of clothes, and things that have been tried on get put away for a week, or the sort of dwell time that a virus can survive on a material, and then they're brought back. Could they expose them to UV light? Would that be enough? Clothing? So there are technologies to destroy the virus. In terms of UV light, the amount of UV light you need to destroy virus is quite intense. So this is not something you're going to want your Gap employee necessarily deploying, because there are other health risks that come along with that. So I think, because this virus is likely going to be with us long term, we may see more technological innovations to get towards sterilization. And I think clothing is one of the best examples of a shared surface that we may all handle in a store that could be a source of infection. So for that reason, I think there are many smart people thinking about how do we mitigate the risk in this circumstance. But because we don't have solid answers yet, I think this is one of the classes of business that people are still kind of scratching their heads on. So I'm confident that there will be a fix or will be a way to mitigate this and reduce the risk, but it may not be as straightforward as we would all like.
Steve, do you have another question for us?
I do. We got a question from Christine. She wants to know, aren't many small businesses going to feel compelled to raise prices? They've got fewer customers that can be accommodated, and sanitation takes time between customers. Are they going to have to raise prices in order to survive?
Well, we've seen prices in a lot of areas rise because of supply issues, like groceries, for example. But who wants to answer that question?
Well, I could take a crack at it. I mean, there are going to be circumstances where just the cost of doing business goes up, and when it goes up for the entire market, then generally that will result in some upward pressure on prices. But I think that also technology and practices are going to catch up with it. So as we figure this out and tailor the risks and the mitigation, and then scale those practices up, that we'll get more efficient at it. But in the beginning, I think it's going to be fairly inefficient.
Kate, you had an observation?
I think the restaurant industry, food industry is probably our most vulnerable marketplace right now in terms of downtown and independence. They operate on a really small margin. And I think right now people are really focused and feeling like they're shopping local. They want to support. They're tipping on carryout as much as they would for an in-house experience, or they should be. They're eager to support businesses and mindful that that's realistic, right? If you have fewer covers on a Thursday night, you might have to pay more for a hamburger. I think it's a reasonable exchange. You were talking too about the online experience, Brian. I mean, we have people sitting home right now, and we're essentially training them to shop online, which is it's not ideal when we're anticipating foot traffic return and those traditional means of supporting our downtown centers. What we do see right now is that those who are poised to innovate are coming out a little bit stronger through this. And what we have known is that if you have an online presence as a small mom and pop shop, you are better going into COVID-19 conditions. And those who haven't had it, we are seeing they're really putting an emphasis where possible, where they have the resources, on expediting a means or platform to go online and offer the goods. And when they do that, I think they have a much more loyal clientele of local residents and visitors who are very, very eager to support their downtown businesses and other independent retailers.
Neitzel, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. So of the retail places you visit, are there certain places where you feel like you're more likely to be exposed than others because of, I don't know, surfaces, or like we were talking about trying on clothes, or using the restroom at the fast food outlet? I mean, are there places you would be more cautious than others?
Who is that question for?
For Rick. I'm sorry, for
Okay.
Rick.
And I'm sorry, my internet is cutting in and out. Lester, could I just get you to quickly repeat that?
So yeah, I'm wondering if there are some kinds of retail operations you'd be more concerned about going into than others. And I was thinking, you mentioned the clothing situation. Are there other kind of retail situations where you'd be more concerned? Would you be concerned about using a public restroom?
Okay, so great question. And so I think we've identified maybe a whole spectrum here. The idea of a big box store where we can maintain low density of both customers and employees, that definitely falls onto the lower end of the risk spectrum. I think anytime we start getting into personal services, so the example of the physical therapist that was brought up earlier by Kate, I think is a great example where it's really hard to imagine how to mitigate that risk down to the level that we see in the big box store. I think small businesses can certainly maintain low density with a thoughtful approach and metering of customers. So I think we will see a whole spectrum of risk, but I think those direct services, so, you know, massage, occupational therapy, physical therapy, those are the sorts of things where we're going to have to be even more thoughtful because the infection risk is just inherently higher for that kind of business. And I hope you heard that. I hope I'm not breaking up too.
Yep, no, you're coming through loud and clear here. Steve, you got another question?
Yes, we have two questions somewhat related, but it has to do with employees and workplaces. One is the question of what owners and employees can do when customers refuse to follow the rules with social distancing, wearing masks. I don't know if this was addressed, but obviously we've seen news stories about that. And then somewhat related to that is a question about protections that are in place for whistleblowing employees against an employer that is cutting corners while keeping up the appearance of compliance to the public.
So I want to tell you about an acquaintance of mine who owns a business in town, and he was complaining that a lot of people are going to the stores who ask their patrons to wear masks, and they don't. And he just thought that was just not very respectful of the business owner's request and irresponsible to the public at large. We're seeing some of that already. They're just ignoring the rules. We saw, you know, that terrible situation at the dollar store in Flint where the security guard was killed because of a dispute about wearing a mask. We saw the barber this week in Owasso in Shiawassee County whose license was revoked because he decided, I'm going to do this anyway. And the pictures I saw by one of my colleagues showed patrons in there without a mask or anything else getting their hair cut. What should we do? What does a business have the right to say, you cannot come in here, you will not come into my store without a mask? Brian?
Well, they certainly do have that right. So it's private property. You set the conditions under which somebody comes to into your store. Some feel much more comfortable enforcing that than others. But I think what's going to happen is these practices become much more mainstream than it's new right now. There's some resistance. Some of it is even kind of found its way into this political system. Like, what side of the political fight are you on? Do you wear a mask or do you not wear a mask? But but ultimately, I think that they're going to become more mainstream. And Rick would know better in terms of how you get your overall end size as low as possible. But you know, when you have the majority of the population complying, that actually does provide some level of protection to the entire population. And so I think that's what the goal that we need to get is to a point where we kind of normalize these practices. So it's not something extra that we're doing anymore. It's just our regular lives that we're living, and it becomes the exception to the rule. And I'm afraid, Lester, we're always going to have those exceptions.
Well, let me flip this, because I was just at a convenience store the other day. I walked in with mask and gloves. None of the customers had a mask on. The clerks did not have a mask or gloves. They're handling my material. They're wanting to, you know, scan my card and want me to hand it to them, which kind of irritated me because she was not wearing gloves. She didn't have a mask on. They did, I will say, have the plexiglass sheet. But doctor, I mean, what do you think of that kind of a situation? Would you patronize that store again?
No, I would not. And I think this is going to be something that drives the evolution of businesses is customers, probably a majority of customers experiencing that situation will have the same response you did. I don't like the way this is being done. I don't feel comfortable and safe here. I'm not going to come here again. And I think that will force the business either to adapt their practices, or they may unfortunately, you know, not be able to exist if they're not willing to go with these mitigation recommendations. I want to also come back to something that Brian said that really resonated. So, you know, a way to make sure that employees are towing the line, wearing the protective gear that they're supposed to wear, comes back to this communication piece. And I think communicating expectations on the part of the employer, this is the obligation you have to work here, to wear these protective practices, and also to empower them to deal with customers and know that they have the employer's backing to say, we would really prefer you to wear a mask. We have to acknowledge that there is a fraction of the population that is not medically able to wear a mask, which is just one more reason that PPE is our last approach, because not everybody can wear them. We don't want masks on very young children, for example, or people with respiratory conditions. So I think customer choices are very much going to come into play here, and people will stop patronizing a store that feels unsafe and not taking the pandemic seriously.
Kate, what kind of conversations are the people in Farmington, the downtown merchants in Farmington having about this kind of thing?
That's an interesting question. That specifically I haven't come across. We're looking at public risk, people's appetite for getting back out and being together. We don't really know how to gauge that. Whether you're opening up your restaurant and trying to decide how much food to order upon reentry when you have half capacity in your footprint and you don't know how many people are going to feel comfortable, or that's a great question. How will you deal with those who don't have the same sense of urgency or immediacy in keeping your base covered? I can share a very brief story. Our market manager, our farmers market manager, he's opening up tomorrow for the first time in the season under very restricted conditions, is recovered. He's recovering from coronavirus. And a few weeks ago, on one of his first nights out, he's walking through downtown at 8 o'clock at night. And one of our really terrific retailers, a baker who's working at 10 o'clock at night, sees him and runs out of the street and says, "What are you doing without a face mask? What are you thinking?" So the recovered market manager is thinking, I'm assuming I'm immune. It's 8 o'clock at night. I'm not shopping. I'm not out. I'm just on the street without a face mask. And the business owner who was working at 10 o'clock, frankly, overtime just to keep up with the circumstances they're dealing with right now, they had a real in-depth conversation on the spot about what that perception would be or is. And really, perception is reality. That baker limits customers to 3 at a time in the store. Everyone has to have a mask covering on. It's a food business, but we have to be able to have those conversations probably before we run into each other in a public confrontation or a spot where we're jockeying for personal space or a circumference of about 10 safe feet. But that will be really interesting as we reopen, how we navigate those spaces together, because the observation that people have different levels of comfort, whether they should be wearing PPE, out on the street or only in businesses. I mean, there's a wide variety of perception. We all see people running. I see people running down Heinz Drive wearing, the welding mask. Is that necessary? Probably not. But it's their comfort level, and I think it will take a gradual reopening with an understanding as we go along of with the information we have at that time.
Keep looking for the next question, but before we get to it, I want to ask Rick, do we yet know if you've already had COVID-19 and recovered, are you immune?
We don't know that to the best of my awareness. So that would be the ideal situation. And I think many of us are hoping that's the case, but we don't have sort of definitive proof that that is in fact the case.
Steve?
Okay, I know we're getting closer to our time limit, but a couple other questions I want to see if we can get to. One was about the fact that a common economic indicator is consumer confidence, which is another way of saying the emotional state of the consumer. Can the panelists speak to the role of business in addressing the rampant fear and understandable anxiety of employees and customers when it comes to returning to business as normal?
Well, the U of M does one of the biggest surveys on consumer attitudes, and I haven't seen one lately. Brian, let's start with you. This is going to have to be our last question because we're running out of time here. What do you think of that question? What can you tell us?
Consumer confidence is really paramount for everything. In terms of what the long-term economic health is, if you don't win the confidence of the consumer, then it's the economic battle is going to be a lost battle. So I think that the federal response to federal assistance has been very robust. I think they've given people more economic security than we could have ever imagined after such a dramatic decline in overall economic activity. But at the same time, in terms of re-engaging out there more broadly, we saw one thing happen in Wisconsin. We saw something else happen in Georgia, though, where Georgia kind of intentionally opened up, not as much economic activity as you would have thought. Wisconsin, it was a court decision, and then it looked, at least the pictures kind of looked like they had a lot of activity. So I think that we're going to have different responses all over the place, but winning the confidence of the consumer, I think, is going to be paramount to long-term economic health.
Kate, can you address the same question?
I think it's working together with your customer, and I think smaller businesses in some ways have that advantage over larger brands and chains, just maintaining that personal relationship. We're seeing virtual events. We know with our business mix downtown, and as we're looking at our cultural programming, the impact of canceling our Art of the Grand, because we know we can't bring 40,000 people downtown, but holding fast a little bit on our concert programming for the summer, we're optimistic. We feel like we're small enough with a local enough draw that we can make a last minute decision on whether we stage some sort of socially distanced, public health compliant programming that everyone can, with some level of confidence, if they're feeling that they'd like to venture out, we'd love to have them. But what we do know is that we cannot wait to be back together. We have people baking bread together, 300 people baking virtual bread through Sunflower Bakehouse. We have our cheese store offering virtual cheese and wine, where you pick up your kit on the curbside, you go home, and on a Zoom call format like this, you can have a drink with your neighbors in your community. And so we know that those are ways to stay in front of people, to stay connected, and to maintain confidence and transparency and whatever those state guidelines are on re-entering business and joining together again. We can't wait.
Rick, I'm going to give you the last question, and that is, what advice do you have for all of us, whether we're business owners or whether we're patrons? What should we be thinking about as we try to reopen this economy?
So I'm going to come back to a theme that we've touched on a couple times already, which is communication. I think businesses absolutely need to communicate to their customers, and there's many ways that they can do that. Hey, we're taking this seriously. Here are the steps we've taken to make your shopping or customer experience as safe as possible. Communication to the employees. Hey, here are the steps we're taking to minimize the risk associated with your job. And as I said, there's many ways to communicate that. If you go to your local shop and there's a bunch of signs out that lay out their social distancing requirements, their website notes that you can do curbside delivery or curbside pickup. So it's a whole suite of things, I think, but that communication that this is a priority and this is something that we're taking very seriously is going to be key to get the consumers back in the shop. It's also going to be key to get the employees feeling protected, which I think is going to have some secondary benefits in terms of sort of employee pride that we're adopting, not just the bare minimum, but the best practices that are going to make this the safest retail or other establishment in town.
Rick Neitzel is Associate Professor of Global Public Health at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Kate Knight is Director of Farmington's Downtown Development Authority. Thank you, Kate. And Brian Calley Brian Calley is the president of the Small Business Association of Michigan and, of course, our former Lieutenant Governor. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Lester. Great to be with you and Rick and Kate.
This has been an interesting event. I've done a lot of issues and ales over the years. The first one I've ever done online, I think it went pretty well, except for my battery going out. Apologies for that. I also want to remind you that we really appreciate the sustaining members who've joined us tonight and those who continue to support the station. As Steve mentioned at the top of the show, we are going to have a one-day fund drive on Tuesday because we just cannot afford to give up a week of reporters asking you for money. So we're asking you, take a moment, give to the station. We're going to continue to do our job, and we appreciate the fact that you've been generous in supporting us in the past. We hope you'll help us now. Thanks very much. Steve, any final words?
No, I want to thank everyone for joining us online and all of our panel today. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get all the questions, but we're going to hopefully be able to continue this conversation as well on our website and on our Facebook page in the future and answer some of your questions that way. So thank you to everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.